Water, sand, and muscle guys on a mission. We're not talking about spring break in Panama City. This is Sandcastle. Sandcastle is directed by Fernando Coimbra, the talented guy behind Narcos and A Wolf at the Door. It was written by Chris Rosner, who was an actual veteran who spent time in Iraq trying to make a difference, and this movie is based off of his experiences. It stars the always outstanding Nicholas Hoult, who you guys will recognize from X-Men, Mad Max Fury Road, and Warm Bodies. Another standout is Logan Marsh, who you guys will recognize from Upgrade, The Invitation, and Spider-Man Homecoming. It also stars Henry Cavill, who you guys will recognize from Mission Impossible, Superman, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and the upcoming Witcher series. So the movie follows a young soldier during the Iraq invasion, his struggle to make sense of things, and his desire to make a difference while he is serving in the military and in Iraq. So as you guys know, when I talk about movies, I talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. All that being said, let's talk about the good. This is, without a doubt, one of the most realistic depictions you're going to see of modern warfare. It's not like in a lot of other movies where it's action scene, you know, big gung-ho soldiers doing all these really heroic acts and all this kind of stuff. You have some of that in here, but it's used sparingly. And just like in the real military, you see all these different soldiers, their different personalities, their different motivations, and their different reasons for joining up. Now, this being directed by Fernando Coimbra, it is definitely done with a sense of realism, and there are some pretty long takes that get you immersed into the film. They also really add to the tension building of certain scenes. The introduction of the movie definitely lets you know who Okra, the young soldier, is right away. It shows you that he does not want to be there, and he's just trying to get home. And as the movie goes on, you know, the things he thinks and the stuff that he wants to do definitely transition to something else. So the closed-minded nature of these troops, their rough and gruff, you know, language, and their sense of humor is all very spot on. Now, this film does touch on some pretty big issues. You know, it goes into the fact that a lot of soldiers, not just American troops, but, you know, troops all over the world, they go in with this wide-eyed optimism and they really want to help and make a difference, especially those who volunteered to serve. And eventually, a lot of times, something really bad happens and that optimism turns into a sense of pessimism or even nihilism, and eventually can lead to post-traumatic stress. You know, there's some pretty authentic things that happen in here, like soldiers are talking about home and the things that they miss and what they really want to do when they get back. That conversation happens all the time in the military. The fact that you get tasked for a lot of missions that are basically futile in nature, you know you're not going to be able to do it, and yet the military still sends you to this place to try to make this thing happen. That's the thing about U.S. troops. They will definitely try and make something happen. And a lot of times it is without proper gear, it's without the resources that they need, so they have to use their can-do attitude and ingenuity to make that thing work. In most cases, they do. In some cases, they don't, whether that be because of, you know, the stuff that they were or were not given, or because of outside influencers or aggressors actually basically killing the mission or the troops themselves. And again, this film is carried by the performances of these actors. You've got Harper's leadership in a very natural way, which I've seen with a lot of people in the military. You've got Okra's innocence because he's this young guy and it's his first time in combat. You've got Chutsky's pessimism. Then you've got Burton and Enzo's really tight camaraderie. It all comes across very natural, and it is what you would see in a unit or, you know, in a group of guys put together for a certain mission. You might not trust somebody, but you will definitely make it work because you have to. You have to rely on each other to survive. There were a lot of people that I was working with that I didn't like, and a lot of other people didn't like, but we still had to trust that person to have our backs so that we could live and survive together. Obviously, Holt and Cavill are both not from the US. They're not Americans, but their accents in this film are great, especially Cavill's southern accent. It is spot on. I think I only heard it slip one time, and I lived in the South for a long time. He sounds just like one of the good old boys that you'd run to in like Tennessee or Georgia or whatever. This movie really portrays the, you know, the violence and the danger and all that stuff you would experience during wartime or during a mission in a conflict area. And this actually takes place before the big insurgency started happening. And you see all these events through a very clear lens. It's nice framing, the color grading is just right. It is wide open, you know, you see a lot of stuff. And, you know, there are tight shots when it's needed, you know, close-ups for emotional impact and all that kind of stuff. You know, this is the actual middle of the desert. They shot this in Jordan and Abu Dhabi, so you really get that Middle East feel because it is shot in the Middle East. There is some CGI, but it's very subtle and it really works. There is a ton of great practical effects in here, whether it be, you know, gore or whether it be explosions, bullets, and all that kind of stuff. Everything looks and and just feels real. But they don't just focus on the soldiers either. They show the desperation of the civilian population because, as always, in wartime, the civilians are adversely affected. Now, I was really impressed with a lot of the little touches when it came to showing the civilian population. Obviously, they're showing Arabs. There's parts where you hear the call to prayer in the background. There's one part where a woman kind of adjusts her hijab because she doesn't want the soldiers to look directly at her. You see sometimes, an Arab who's hosting the soldiers and he serves them tea, and of course they take it because it's good manners. If you're ever in an Arab household and they offer you tea, accept it, because the tea here is just mwah. And that leads me to the next thing, is the relationship that they show between the soldiers and the civilian population and them trying to band together. You've got some civilians who don't want to help, and that's for a good reason. They're worried they're going to get hurt or killed or whatever, and then they're worried that their families are going to be in danger. But then you have others who are trying to make a stand. They really put themselves out there. The music throughout the film, it really emphasizes certain parts, and it really gives it an emotional impact. Now, unfortunately, in wartime and conflict, there are going to be very real consequences to the soldiers and to civilians. You're going to have injuries, you're going to have deaths, you're going to have torture, you're going to have all this kind of stuff. All that is portrayed in this film, and it's done in an unflinching way and a very realistic way. I also liked how they showed that a lot of what Westerners perceive to be, the way that people in the Middle East act are not true. And that's because, what Westerners are seeing is only what the mainstream media gives them. And this movie really goes into those subtle things, the things that you won't see on the media. And that's, again, because it was written by a soldier who was over here and he was working with the civilian population. It's also pretty spot on when it comes to showing what soldiers will do back in their barracks, back in base, when they don't have a lot of stuff to preoccupy them. They get bored and they do some really dumb shit like the pranks and just different pastimes that they come up with. It really makes you laugh, and it gives you insight onto what you would actually see if you were at that base. So you do develop an emotional connection with these soldiers and with these civilians, because you see a lot of these little things that you normally wouldn't see in other military films. I definitely recommend that you guys watch this and Jarhead and Generation Kill, because they'll give you a lot of insight into troops, their mindset, how they go about doing things, and the stuff that they have to deal with in today's military. There's something that soldiers and even people in prison have when you're about to get out. You kind of don't want to. You kind of feel like you have to stay in because this is what you're used to, or because maybe, in the military's case, you have these brothers or sisters that you don't want to leave. You want to make sure that they can get home too. If it's your time to get out, you need to go into that civilian world and you need to make that adjustment. And they kind of touch on that, especially towards the end of the film. So obviously there is a lot of good, a lot of stuff to like about this film, but let's talk about the bad. The uniforms in this film are a mess. They are all over the place. Your uniforms are going to be a little different. You're going to be more relaxed with that and stuff. But usually there's going to be a sergeant or, a commander or somebody who's going to try to keep everybody uniform and try to keep them in check, because there are regulations. And in this movie, man, you've got, one unit and soldiers wearing the same uniform in 5-6 different ways. Not really a bad, to be honest, but it is an inconsistency that a lot of the military people watching are going to notice. While the depictions of these soldiers, the way they think, the stuff that they say, are realistic, they will leave a sour taste in many viewers' mouths because they don't get to see this real side of the troops a lot in movies. And that speaks to the crude language and the humor. People who have served in the military, whether currently or formerly, including myself, are prone to gallows humor. We have a very, very dark sense of humor, and that's basically a coping mechanism to deal with all the stuff that we've seen or experienced or been involved in. And they definitely show that in this movie, and it's definitely going to turn people off who aren't used to that. The pacing's really going to turn off a lot of people, and I've heard people who watched this movie talk about how it was too slow and there wasn't enough action and all that. But that is the nature of the military. It's so bad that we have a saying, hurry up and wait. Hurry up and get to where you're supposed to be and wait for more orders. You have these long moments of dull, boring stuff, but then it's punctuated by these huge, fast, quick, brutal moments of action. This movie is geared towards realism. It's not supposed to be this big action romp. It's not Black Hawk Down. And the only reason Black Hawk Down is the way it is because that's exactly how it happened. Even this movie, their mission, which is to rebuild this water station, in real life, the guy who wrote the movie, their job was to rebuild this cafe where a lot of the local leaders and the military would meet, and they would try to hash things out and work together properly. And every time they would get this cafe rebuilt or whatever, they'd get attacked. And that kind of stuff happens with these guys while they're portrayal of Arabs in this movie, for the most part, is done pretty well. It's still written by a Westerner's perspective. So when they talk about like Shia and Sunni and why they fight and why they take from one another and all this kind of stuff, okay, that does happen a little bit, but it's not nearly what they talk about in the film. I have plenty of friends who are Shia and Sunni and they get along great. Passage of time in this movie can be a little disorienting, and I think that might be a point that they're trying to make, because that's the nature of being deployed. You know, I was deployed anywhere from 4 months to a year, and time can go really slow or it can go really fast, and it changes throughout your deployment. But the way that they do it with certain cuts and transitions and cross dissolves and stuff, it can really throw you off and make you wonder, like, wait, now where are we and what time is it and what happened in between? There's this big surprise that kind of happens towards the end of the movie. Anyone who's, you know, somewhat initiated, you know, whether it be with the military or military movies, or especially if you've been in the service, when it happens, it hits you and you have this emotional response, but you definitely see it coming for a good amount of time. Overall, this movie I think is excellent. I think it's definitely a must-see for anybody who wants to know what the military is like these days. And I think it's really good for military people to watch, because you get to see what you deal with all the time on the big screen. So with all that being said, does Sandcastle stand tall in the pantheon of military films, or does it crumble under the weight of this realistic portrayal? Drum roll, please. 7 out of 10.